I never thought a simple computer malfunction could change my life forever, turn it completely upside down. And yet it did. All because my neighbor came to my rescue and said something that shook me. Something I'd always known deep down but never dared to admit to myself. I never expected it to happen on a Tuesday morning either. Not while I stood barefoot in my kitchen, holding a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Cook," wondering whether the blinking cursor on my laptop meant the whole thing was about to die. I'm 61 years old. I've been married for 38 of them. My husband, Gary, is a good man, steady, predictable. He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't come home late, doesn't forget to mow the lawn. He loves routine the way some people love jazz, unapologetically and without need for explanation. But lately, I felt like wallpaper in my own home, decorative, fading, easy to overlook. I don't know when exactly it started, this quiet slipping away of myself. Maybe after our son moved out. Maybe after Gary retired and started spending his afternoons in front of the television, nodding off to reruns and sports talk. Maybe it was the silence between us that started to stretch just a little too long. Whatever the reason, I had grown used to being quiet, used to listening more than speaking, used to filling my days with laundry, grocery lists, and puzzle books, the kind of life that hums but never sings. So when the screen on my laptop froze for the 4th time that week, I did something out of character. I went next door. Our neighbor Paul had moved in 6 months ago, a retired teacher in his mid-60s, recently divorced, quiet and polite. We'd waved from across our driveways, swapped a few comments about the weather, the neighborhood, the recycling schedule. That was about it. But that morning, I stood on his porch, palms slightly damp, wondering why asking for tech help suddenly made me feel like a teenager with a crush. He answered the door in reading glasses and a fleece zip-up. "Hey there," he said. "Everything okay?" "My computer's acting up," I said. "I didn't want to bother you, but I thought maybe if you had a minute." "Sure," he replied easily. "I've got time. Let me grab my shoes." It wasn't dramatic, not a movie scene. But the way he looked at me, directly, kindly, made me realize how long it had been since someone gave me their full attention, without a distracted smile or a glance at the clock. Back at my kitchen table, I watched as he leaned over my laptop, tapping keys with gentle precision. I made us coffee out of habit. I didn't expect him to stay. But he did. We talked about nothing and about everything. About how frustrating technology can be, about how hard it is to keep track of passwords, about how this generation was born into it, but we're all just catching up, one error message at a time. He laughed when I said I'd once accidentally deleted my entire inbox, trying to unsubscribe from a gardening newsletter. And then he looked at me, really looked, and said, "You have a calming way about you. I can see why plants thrive around you." It was such a simple comment, but it landed like a warm hand on my shoulder. Later, after he left and the cursor finally blinked back to life, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen with the coffee gone cold. The house felt the same. Gary was still upstairs, asleep in his recliner. The television droned on. But I wasn't the same. Something in me stirred, not longing, not infatuation, just a flicker, a reminder that I existed. That someone had looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. I didn't know what to do with that feeling yet. So I folded the dish towel. I put the mugs away. I opened a blank document on my newly working laptop and stared at the blinking cursor. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. The next morning, I lingered over my coffee longer than usual. The house was quiet, as always. Gary had already left for his morning walk. Returning around the same time each day, with a newspaper under his arm and a list of complaints about the neighbor's dog or the price of eggs. I didn't mind the quiet. In fact, I'd made peace with it years ago. But that morning, it felt different, like silence with an echo. I kept thinking about Paul's visit, not in a romantic sense. I wasn't daydreaming like a schoolgirl with stars in her eyes. It wasn't about that. It was about the way he listened. The way he made space for my words to land. Most people don't do that, you know? They wait for their turn to speak, eyes scanning the room, fingers twitching toward their phone. But Paul had listened like my thoughts were something worth hearing. And maybe they were. I told myself not to make anything of it. He was just being kind, helpful, friendly. But even so, I found myself wiping down the counters a little more carefully, straightening the stack of mail by the fruit bowl. Checking the mirror before heading out to pull weeds in the garden. A few days passed without seeing him. I didn't expect him to come by again. Why would he? He'd fixed the computer. There was no unfinished business, no reason to linger. But sometimes we don't need a reason, just an excuse. Mine came on a Thursday afternoon when I noticed my printer blinking red again. Paper jam. I'd dealt with it before, but I suddenly felt less confident. Or maybe I just wanted a reason to walk next door. I didn't, though. Not right away. I waited, sat on the porch with my tea, pretending to read the same page in a novel I'd started 6 months ago. My eyes kept drifting toward his driveway. His car was there. And then, like I had summoned him, he appeared, carrying a bag of groceries from the trunk of his car, his keys jangling as he fumbled with the gate. He saw me and smiled. That same warm, quiet smile that somehow didn't feel rehearsed. "You're always out here," he said, walking toward the fence. "You must like the fresh air." "It's peaceful," I replied, "and the light's best in the afternoon." He glanced at the book in my lap. "Reading anything good?" "Trying to," I said with a small laugh. "But I keep getting distracted." Life has a way of doing that. He didn't invite himself over. He didn't press, just stood there, leaning slightly on the fence post, his groceries at his feet, as though we were two old friends falling into a rhythm we didn't know we had. "Printer's jammed," I said, not quite meaning to say it aloud. "Again, I'm starting to think your electronics are rebelling against you." "Wouldn't be surprised." A beat passed. Then, without a word, he reached down, picked up the grocery bag, and said, "Give me 10 minutes to put these away." I nodded, trying to keep my smile from stretching too wide. 10 minutes later, he was back, kneeling beside my printer, sleeves rolled up, fingers moving with gentle certainty. I stood a few steps away, watching, not just him, but the way the light hit the side of his face, the way he squinted slightly when reading the tiny print on the error screen. "You're good at this," I said. "Spent 30 years teaching kids how to troubleshoot computers. I guess some things stick." He fixed it in less than 5 minutes, but he didn't leave right away. We sat at the kitchen table again, sipping tea this time. The conversation meandered, from the weather to retirement to the strange satisfaction of untangling holiday lights. At one point, I told him how I used to work at a bookstore before I became a full-time mother. How I missed being around stories, how the smell of old pages still felt like home. "You light up when you talk about books," he said quietly. And I realized then how rarely anyone had told me that I lit up, that something in me still sparked. When he left, the house felt quieter, but not in the usual way. It wasn't empty. It was full of something I couldn't quite name. Like the lingering scent of something warm just taken out of the oven. Faint, but real. I washed our mugs, dried my hands, and stood still for a moment, just breathing. There was nothing dramatic about it. No declarations, no secrets. But for the first time in years, someone had seen me. And not just the outline of who I was, but the substance. And suddenly, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to being invisible. I've always believed there's a difference between loneliness and being alone. Being alone is easy, peaceful even. You can fold laundry without chatter, sip tea without interruption, listen to the creak of the house settling and find it oddly comforting. But loneliness, that's different. It creeps in quietly, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It doesn't announce itself. It lingers in the spaces where conversation used to live. In the moments where a touch should be, but isn't. I had lived with loneliness so long that I'd stopped noticing it, until it left for a little while. After Paul's last visit, the house felt different. Not noisier, but fuller, as if something unseen had pulled up a chair and decided to stay. His presence hadn't rearranged my life. It had just added color to the corners I had stopped painting. The next few days passed with an odd kind of anticipation. I didn't go looking for him. Not directly, but I found myself glancing toward the window more often, listening for sounds beyond my own routine. Gary didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't say. He still ate his cereal with the same absent-minded focus, still read the paper cover to cover, still offered the occasional in response to things I said. Our rhythm hadn't changed, but I had. One afternoon, while sorting through the kitchen drawer where everything without a proper home ends up, batteries, rubber bands, mismatched keys, I found an old bookmark. It was cloth, frayed at the edges, with a quote embroidered in fading thread. And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. I'd forgotten I had it. Forgotten I used to keep it tucked into my favorite novel. Forgotten I used to read poetry on purpose, not just by accident. I placed it on the counter beside the fruit bowl and left it there. A quiet reminder. That evening, as I watered the potted herbs on the back porch, I heard the gate creak. I turned, expecting the wind. It was Paul. He held a small pot of rosemary in one hand and a folded newspaper under his arm. I remembered you said yours was struggling, he said, gesturing to the herbs. This one's doing well. Thought you might like a backup. It was such a small gesture, but it undid me. Would you like some iced tea? I asked. He smiled. I'd love that. We sat on the porch, the sun easing its way behind the trees, the ice clinking softly in our glasses. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, like an old sweater you hadn't worn in years, but somehow still fixed just right. At one point, he asked, "Do you ever miss who you were before life got so quiet?" The question hit harder than he could have known. I nodded slowly. Sometimes I wonder if that version of me still exists. He didn't offer reassurance or deny it. He just looked at me and said, "I think she does. I think she's just waiting." It stayed with me. Later that night, I lay in bed next to Gary, who was already asleep, his breathing deep and steady. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the woman I used to be, the one who laughed louder, dressed brighter, painted late into the night while listening to music. I hadn't mourned her. I just misplaced her. But now, someone had reminded me she might still be somewhere inside, beneath the quiet, beneath the chores, beneath the years. I didn't know what to do with that feeling, not yet. But I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to give up on her. The next morning, I got up earlier than usual. The house was still wrapped in that tender hush that only exists before the world is fully awake. Gary was snoring softly in the bedroom, and even the birds seemed to be stretching into their song. I made coffee and stood at the sink while it brewed, looking out the kitchen window. The rosemary Paul had brought sat on the windowsill, its scent already gently rising with the steam. I reached out and touched the leaves, soft, alive, thriving. And for the first time in years, I opened the guest room closet and pulled out the old wooden box I hadn't touched since my son's graduation. It was heavier than I remembered. Inside, my paints, watercolors, dusty but intact, brushes with frayed tips, a few stiff palettes, their dried swirls still echoing the last thing I ever tried to create, a clumsy landscape that I never quite finished. I laid it all out on the desk, not with any plan, just to see. The sunlight through the curtains fell across the paper like a spotlight. I sat down, picked up a brush, dipped it in water, and pressed the soft hairs into a patch of deep blue. It bled onto the page, imperfect, uncontrolled, but beautiful in its own way. I didn't paint long, just enough to remember what it felt like. That afternoon, I heard Paul's voice through the open kitchen window. He was talking to our other neighbor across the fence. I couldn't hear the words, just the cadence, calm and deliberate. Then footsteps, the crunch of gravel, a moment of hesitation, and then a knock. I opened the door with paint still smudged on my hands. He noticed. Working on something? Just revisiting an old part of myself, I said with a smile. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't have to. There was an unspoken rhythm between us now. He simply followed me into the kitchen, where the scent of rosemary and turpentine mingled. I used to paint, I said, gesturing toward the guest room. Years ago, before life got busy. I'm glad you're painting again, he said. We stood there for a moment, the space between us full of something quiet and kind. And then, to my surprise, I found myself saying, I used to dance too, in the living room, when no one was home. He chuckled. What stopped you? I shrugged. Life, responsibilities, the feeling that there was always something more important to do. Paul nodded, but didn't speak, just waited. And now? He finally asked. I don't know, I said honestly. But today, I picked up a brush. Maybe next week I'll turn the music on. That night after Gary went to bed, I stayed up in the guest room. I didn't paint. I just sat, looking out the window, remembering who I used to be, not with regret, but with curiosity. Like seeing an old friend across the street and wondering what you'd say if you finally waved hello. And in the stillness, I realized something that both comforted and unnerved me. It wasn't Paul who had awakened this part of me. It was me. He had simply reminded me it was still there. And somehow, that made all the difference. The next morning, I woke up before Gary again. But this time, I didn't linger in bed. I got up, tied my robe, and opened the curtains wide, letting the sunlight flood the room. I don't know why, but everything looked slightly brighter. Not new, just less gray. I made a proper breakfast. Not just toast and tea, but eggs and sautéed mushrooms and a little sprig of rosemary on the side. Gary noticed. You cooking for someone? He asked, only half joking. No, I said, placing the plate in front of him. Just felt like making something warm. He muttered a thanks and turned on the TV. I sat across from him, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Not with Paul exactly, but with the version of me that had returned quietly, like a stray cat scratching at the door. After breakfast, I went back into the guest room. The painting I'd started the day before had dried overnight. The colors had softened, bleeding into each other in unexpected ways. It wasn't beautiful, but it was alive. I started another. Time passed. I didn't notice how much until the light in the room changed again. That's when I heard it, the soft knock on the back door. Not the front, the back, like he knew I was in the kitchen. It was Paul. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said, holding up a mason jar with something dark inside. I made blackberry jam. Figured you might like some. I opened the door before I realized I had already started smiling. You didn't have to do that, I said. I know, he replied. We sat on the back porch again. I brought out crackers and cheese, and we opened the jar together. The jam was tart, rich, and messy in the best way. We talked while eating with our hands like kids sneaking snacks before dinner. There was something unspoken between us. Not romantic tension, at least not overt. Just presence. That word again. The way he listened. The way he let silences stretch without trying to fix them. Eventually, he asked if I'd been painting again. A little, I said. I'd love to see one sometime. The thought made me strangely nervous. No one had asked to see my work in years. Maybe ever. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I didn't say no. We talked for another hour about music, old movies, how both of us missed going to live performances, but never got around to it anymore. He told me about a jazz club he used to visit alone, just to listen. I told him about the time I danced barefoot in the backyard during a summer rainstorm. It had been so long since I shared that memory, I had forgotten how joyful it once felt. When Paul stood to leave, he hesitated for a second. I've been thinking of heading out of town soon, he said. There's some stuff I need to deal with back home. I nodded slowly. Of course, you've been here a while. He looked down at the ground, then back at me. But I've enjoyed this more than I expected. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. Not the polite kind, the real kind. After he left, I sat alone for a long while. There was no ache, no sense of loss, just a soft awareness that something meaningful had happened in my life. Something small, quiet, and important. That night, Gary asked me where the jam came from. Paul made it, I said. Huh, he replied. Didn't know he cooked. I didn't say more. I didn't need to, because it wasn't about jam, or computers, or even painting. It was about feeling seen, and I wasn't ready to let go of that just yet. Paul didn't come by the next day, or the day after. I told myself it was fine. He had mentioned leaving soon. Maybe he was packing. Maybe he had errands. Maybe he just needed space. There were a dozen reasonable explanations, and I told myself every one of them. But still, I found myself glancing toward the fence more often, listening for footsteps on gravel, watching for a flicker of movement past the hedge line. The days returned to their quiet rhythm, but it no longer felt like comfort. It felt like waiting. By the third day, I decided to take the silence as an invitation, not to retreat, but to return to myself. I painted, not just for an hour, but for nearly the entire afternoon. I lost myself in the way colors swirled together, the way water made them bloom like secrets on paper. I stopped trying to make anything pretty. I just created. Later that evening, I set one of the finished pieces on the windowsill to dry. Gary passed by, glanced at it, and paused. "You're really doing this again," he said, not unkindly. "Painting, I mean." I looked up from the sink. "Yes." He nodded. "I like it. You seem lighter lately." That caught me off guard. Gary wasn't the noticing type. Or maybe he used to be, and we both forgot. I wanted to ask what he meant, but instead, I dried my hands and said, "Thank you." He didn't say more. Just sat at the table with his paper. But it lingered between us, the simple acknowledgement that something had changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was upset, but because something inside me felt restless, awake, as if the part of me I'd rediscovered didn't want to return to hibernation. I sat at the kitchen table, lights off, just watching the moonlight stretch across the tile floor. That's when I heard it. Not a knock, a soft rustle outside. Then, a tap on the glass, gentle, like rain. I stood, heart caught between hope and reason, and opened the back door. Paul was there, holding something under his arm. I wasn't sure if it was too late, he said softly. I almost turned around. "It's not too late," I said, stepping aside. He came in, shaking a bit from the cool air. Under his arm was a rolled-up piece of brown craft paper. He placed it on the table carefully. "I went to the city today," he said. "Picked this up for you." I unrolled it slowly. It was a set of high-quality watercolor brushes and a blank sketch pad. Thick paper, the kind that doesn't buckle underwater. The kind you don't buy unless you believe someone will really use it. "I wanted you to have something better to work with," he added. My throat tightened. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just keep going." We sat in silence after that. No tea, no music, just the sound of the refrigerator humming and the soft tick of the clock on the wall. I looked at him, not with longing, but with gratitude. He wasn't here to stir something in me. He already had. He stood to leave after a while. No lingering glance. No need for it. As he reached the door, he turned back one last time. "You're not invisible, Evelyn, not even close." And then he was gone. I didn't cry. Instead, I placed the sketch pad gently on the kitchen table, like something sacred. Then I turned off the light and stood there a moment, hand resting on the doorframe. The house was quiet again. But this time, so was I. Not because I was small or fading, but because I finally felt full. Paul left town the following Tuesday. No formal goodbye. No long, drawn-out moment on the porch. Just a small envelope tucked under the rosemary pot by the window. Inside was a simple note, written in neat, careful script. Thank you for reminding me what still matters. Keep painting, then P. I held the note for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I just stood there, fully present in the silence of my kitchen, aware that someone had walked through my life without asking for anything, and still left something behind. He didn't rescue me. He didn't romance me. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply saw me, and that was enough to remind me I had never truly disappeared, only drifted. And now, I was swimming back to shore. Days passed, then weeks. The rosemary flourished on the sill. My paintings filled the guest room, some unfinished, some bold and messy, some quiet and soft like morning light. I started leaving the door open when I painted, not for anyone to walk in, but so I didn't feel like I was hiding. And slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Gary changed, not in big ways, but in those quiet, everyday gestures that don't announce themselves. He started sitting with me while I painted, at first in silence, then with questions. Is that a sunset? Did you mix that blue yourself? He even brought me a small tray one morning with toast and coffee, on the good plate, the one we hadn't used in years. I didn't expect it. I hadn't asked for it, but I noticed. One night while we were clearing the dishes, he said, I've been thinking about building that birdhouse we talked about years ago. Still have the plans in the garage. I looked up. You remembered that? He nodded. You were excited about it. I guess I should have paid more attention. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. Something in us had shifted, not dramatically, just enough. Like a window cracked open in a stuffy room, letting in air you didn't know you'd been missing. I still thought of Paul sometimes, not with longing, but with warmth. He had been a spark, a mirror, a reminder. But he wasn't the story. I was. I realized I'd spent so many years waiting to feel chosen, by my husband, by my children, by the world, that I'd forgotten how to choose myself. Now I wake early. I make coffee. I water the rosemary. And I paint. Sometimes I dance. Sometimes I sing while I cook. Sometimes I cry, softly, not out of sadness, but from the sweetness of recognizing myself again. Gary and I are not who we once were. But maybe we don't need to be. Maybe now we can become something new. Together, or at least beside each other. Because the truth is, I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not fading. I'm not invisible. I'm here. And every day, with every brushstroke, I remind myself of that. Not for anyone else. Not to be seen. But because I finally see me. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write to the bell, and share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.